Hello and welcome to Sue Finley Designs. Today's video is another beach resin video. Now I get asked quite a lot how to achieve cells in beach art, and it can be quite hit and miss when you're trying to achieve the cells. So in this video I'm going to sort of go through a few things that works for me, and hopefully this will help you when you're trying to achieve cells and lacing in your resin. Now this piece, like a lot of my other beach art, contains real sand, so all I've done here is I've poured the resin into the cup first and then added the sand. Now I did actually put a little bit too much resin in this, that's why I'm tipping some of it into another cup, because I needed to add more sand and then it was going to overflow. So I'm just adding the sand a bit by bit, just until it's well and truly coated. Don't worry if you miss little bits of the sand and you end up with little clumps, because when it's on the board you can actually mix it a little bit further to remove any areas that didn't mix in very well with the resin. So just using a stick here, just making sure that's well and truly coated. Now when adding the sand, obviously the more you add, the thicker it's going to be. So if you want it to sit quite flat on your board, then have the resins and sand so that it's still quite runny. But if you want it to be chunky and you want to create mounds and things on your board, then keep adding the sand till you get it to the consistency that you require. So as you can see, I'm just adding small amounts at a time and mixing that up until I get it to the consistency that I'm after. So I'll just pull the stick out and just see how freely it flows back into the cup. And for this, I want it to flatten down a touch. I don't want it to have large mounds, but I want it to be thick enough so that you can see that there's depth when the resin is poured over the top. So once you have the right consistency, it's then time to pour it over your board. Now I'm not really following any kind of pattern. All I'm doing here is I'm just trying to get as much of the sand onto the board as possible. And as you can see, what I do is I flatten it out a touch by pushing it up into the center. Now this gives me a nice blend between the board and the sand, because you don't want to have a hard line when you pour the resin on the top. So if you blend that slightly by pushing it up, then when you pour the resin you get a nicer effect. Now what I've done here is I've actually mixed up a touch more sand, because I do want this area to be quite thick, but again not big mounds, but just be thicker in that bottom area, so that way if the resin does pour over, it's not going to cover the whole of the sand. And there was a little area there which didn't mix very well, so all I'm doing here is I'm just mixing that up in with the resin, just to make sure that that's well and truly coated with the resin. And by moving it around with the stick, you don't have a uniform pattern, so it will self-level somewhat, so don't worry if you've got like big lumps in some areas. So just using the stick will just push that around a little bit. So next it's time to pour your resin. So here I'm using a jade colour, so it's more greeny than it is blue. And I find that that works really, really well with the ocean pours, because when you mix it then with the blue, you get a nice blend between the two colours and it looks like it's crystal clear waters. And for the blue I'm using Sapphire Blue. Both of those are from Artie Sue. And I'm just obviously just popping any bubbles at this point. And I'll also do the same with the sand. Now you'll need to do the sand a few times with the heat gun, because you will get some bubbles flowing through. Now even though I've left the sand drying for is a good while the sand's been drying, but obviously you're still going to get elements of bubbles coming through on that. And then just using my hand, I'm just blending that slightly and moving it around on the board just to cover the board before pouring another layer on top. And by pushing it around, it just means that when I pour the next layer, it will flow a little bit easier to the edges. And just using my fingers, I'm just dappling between the two colours because that will help blend it, but without or blending it too much. It'll just create ripples between the colours and give it a more natural look. And I just felt it needs a little bit more of the green down towards the sand because there wasn't quite enough there. You could see the blend of the sand into the board a bit too much for my liking, so just making sure that that's well and truly covered. And again, a bit more blue in the top. Now I did mix a little bit of the Stormy Seas in with this blue just to give it a little bit of a darker area at the top, to make it look like the ocean's deeper in that area. And again, a quick zap with the heat gun just to zap any bubbles. And also heating it with the heat gun helps to move the resin slightly as well, so when we come to blend this with our fingers, the resin is going to be moving quite easily. So what we'll do, like I said, mentioned before, I'm just using my fingers, but I'm just dabbling my fingers across the surface, and I'm going to go up and down through and dragging some of the darker blue down and taking some of the green upwards, just so that we've got a blend, but it's not too much, so that when that settles and levels itself out, you can see there's ripples of the different colours. And I'm obviously just making sure the sides have got a touch of resin on there. So once that's done, it's now time to move on to the waves. Now I find that by putting a layer of clear down where you want the waves to go helps with breaking up the white. And it also creates mini waves in the lower layer as well, because as you can see, you start getting different shades just by putting some white on, because it starts to push the lower layer of resin slightly, and so it gives it different tones. And then just going to go over this with the white. Now I often get asked, can you use a hairdryer to blow this? You can, but you need the element of heat, and a hairdryer can perhaps blow it a little bit too much. Now here I'm using a little bit of mineral turpentine. This is an optional thing. I add the mineral turpentine because I find it helps break the resin up just ever so slightly, but you can do it without. Now a big factor in creating the cells and the lacing is your brand of resin, because not all resins are created equally. Some are thicker than others, and the thicker the resin, the harder it is to achieve cells. At the same token, if your resin's too thin, you'll get the cells really easily, but then the resin will level and then you can lose them again. So it's finding that right balance of resin thickness to achieve the cells. Also, having a really good white plays a major factor as well. Now my go-to white is the Lorez Angel White, because it's a really thick paste and it's very, very dense in colour, so that when you blow it with your heat gun, you still get that intense white. You don't lose the white, it doesn't muddy, and it doesn't dissipate. So by using a really good white, this is a major factor in achieving the cells. I've also managed to get a really good cells with using powdered pigment from Langridge. Now their white, titanium white, gives good cells as well. But you just need to be mindful that when you need to mix that into your own paste using part A of your resin, and you need to make sure it's mixed very, very well, because you can be left with clumps of pigment in there. So be mindful of that if you are using the titanium white from Langridge. And I know other people have used other whites. I haven't used any other whites, so I can't give advice on any other whites. These are the only two that I've really achieved good results with. And then using heat will help break it up. So what the heat does is it warms the resin up and helps it move a little bit quicker. But then when the resin starts to cool and it starts to settle, this is where some of the cells and lacing starts to happen. So it's all about a bit of practice. You need to try different resins, you need to try different pigment pastes, and then make sure that your resin is a warmish temperature, and then you stand a good chance of then getting cells. But like I say, at the end of the day, it's down to practice, and you just got to keep trying until you get those happening for you. So I hope you enjoyed this video and it's given you some tips on creating cells in your beach art. If you like this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and better still, subscribe to my channel. I have plenty of other ideas to keep you inspired. So until next time, bye for now.